It's 1 Peter chapter 2. So let me ask you this. Have you ever wanted to go back in time? Have you ever wanted to go back in time? Maybe you wanted to go back in time to a point in your life. Or maybe you wanted to go back in time somewhere in world history to see something, to meet someone, to experience something that you've only read about or seen documentaries made about. Maybe you are that kind of person. You want to go back in history, and maybe some of you are like, no, history is not for me. I don't want to go back. I might rather go forward, but I really would not rather go back. It's funny because in all art forms, television, movies, books, it seems to be sort of obsessed with this idea of time travel. Can we go back in time? Can we change the future if we go back in time? You know, all these different things. Well, today, as we go to this passage in 1 Peter chapter 2, we're going to go back in time to a different culture, a different time, a different experience. And what you're going to see in the text today is you're going to see some terminology in there that may be uncomfortable for us. Because we're going to see terminology today of servants and masters. Some of your translations may say slaves and masters. Peter was certainly living in a different time, living in a different culture. The people that he was writing to, listen to this, over half of that population was comprised of slaves. He is writing to a very different culture than the one that we have today. And some slaves in this time and in this culture were treated like family members in households. Some slaves were given some degree of freedom in their life. But many of the slaves were treated terribly and were seen as almost inhuman. And so, when we enter into a passage like this, it might seem strange to us that Peter does not come straight out and ask everyone to start a slave rebellion or uprising. In fact, what he's going to do is he is going to speak directly to slaves, to servants in this passage. But I want to set it up because I want us to rightly understand why he treats it this way and why we see this same treatment across much of the New Testament. The reason, I believe, is twofold. One of them is perspective. You see, we look back on slavery in this country, and we see it for what it is and what it was. A terrible reduction of people to property. But Peter didn't look back on what it was. He looked into a widespread system of culture in his day, and he saw it as a behemoth that could not be easily changed. The second difference from Peter's day to ours today is how to reform culture. In our day and time, if we have a lot of outside pressure amongst the people, it can be very effective in making changes in our society, particularly because we live in a democracy, right? Peter did not live in a democracy. He did not live in that type of culture. And so outside pressure amongst people would be quickly met with significant campaign-ending physical force. It would be shut down because it was such a large system. So what Peter and wow. Okay, what Peter and others who are writing in the New Testament would do is they didn't want to write to promote some type of outside pressure. They wanted to see the system reformed from within. And watch this. They knew, Peter and other writers knew, that the way to reform culture from within was all about the gospel. That the gospel would change people's hearts. And as it began to change one heart after the next heart after the next heart, then people would see other people not as property, not as people who would be treated as less than, but as people who were created in the image of God. And as we look back over history, we see that Christians were on the front lines to see slavery come to an end. But here's the thing. You're saying, well, Josh, you just said we're going back into a different culture. We don't have this culture today, so can't we just skip this passage? Maybe we can just skip over it. No, there's a reason that God has this in His Word, and I believe that it can continue to be applicable to our life today. Because there are a lot of similarities in the text between what they were going through in their day and time and our modern workplace. We all work for someone, right? We are all under submission to someone. We have authority in our life. And I believe that these verses from 1 Peter chapter 2 can jump right off the text and into our life as we think about, watch this, giving grace in the workplace. That's what we're going to talk about today. Grace in the workplace. For those of you who are college students today, maybe you say, Josh, I don't yet have a full-time job. You might have a part-time job, you might have a side hustle or something like that, but you may not have all the things that we're going to talk about today. Don't tune me out, because here's why. You are under authority as well. You have teachers, you have professors, you have people in your life, and God's Word is going to call us to submit to them. So 2 things I want us to see today from the text. First is this, that we are to submit even when the job is imperfect. I want you to see this in the text. Submit even when the job is imperfect. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18 and following say this, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and the gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin, you are beaten for it and you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. All right, we're going to stop there, because we got enough to unpack here. It says, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect. So, in our case, we should be submissive, and the way we are submissive is through respect to our bosses, to our professors, to our parents. We are to be respectful of them. Let me tell you what respect looks like in the workplace. Respect means showing up on time. Not 5 minutes late, not 15 minutes late. It means showing up on time. Respect means doing what you say you're going to do. If you promise to do something to your boss, he gives you an assignment, and you don't fulfill what you've said you're going to do, that is not a respectful thing. Respect means making your boss, him or her, look good in front of others. Respect means when their back is turned, you don't make snide comments or gestures about them. You see, it's easy to treat a good boss with respect, but what about when you move under a new boss? Your new boss didn't like your old boss. He or she is not any good. They're not good at their job, and they don't treat you well. They don't treat you with respect. They're not treating you in the right way. The Bible says that we should continue to be respectful to them even if they are not respectful to us. In fact, look at what the text says. The text calls them unjust masters. Unjust, this term in the Greek text literally means crooked. A crooked boss, a crooked leader. It is the root word that we have the word scoliosis from. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about someone who is not just, who is not respectful, who is not worthy of honor on the outside. You know, early on in our marriage, Mallory had one of these crooked bosses. I remember one time she came home and she told me, she said, "Josh, I've been working on this project for so long. I've been designing things. I've been putting it all together. I've been ready to submit it. And my boss came and took everything that I had been working on, and in a meeting, he presented all this work that I had done as his own. He presented it as his own so that he could get ahead, so that he could get the glory, so that he could be seen as some creative genius who had just come up magically with all this stuff. He probably didn't know how to design anything. And here's the thing. The text says that we are to continue to show respect and to submit even when we have a leader, a boss, a professor who is not worthy of it. Maybe today you're in the workplace and you've been lied to. You've been lied to by your boss. He said one thing and another has happened. I think about the story of Jacob, who fell in love with one of Laban's daughters. And he went and he asked Laban, he said, "Hey, will you give me the right to marry your daughter?" And Laban told him, "Yes, I will. I'll do that for you. But you have to work for me for 7 years." So Jacob spent a painstakingly long time working for Laban for 7 years. He said, "I want to marry your daughter Rachel. She is beautiful. She is amazing. She is everything." And at the end of 7 years, he said, "Well, look at the time. It looks like we're ready to plan a wedding." And Laban comes and he says, "Well, yes, we are. Leah is ready to marry you." He said, "Hold on. Did her name get changed? Because I didn't want to marry this other daughter of yours. I wanted to marry Rachel." And he said, "Oh, no. Must have been a mix-up. You can have her, but you cannot have Rachel." He said, "If you want Rachel, you've got to work for another 7 years." This woman must have been amazing because he did it. Okay? He was lied to, though. He didn't storm off and have a fit. He didn't do any of that. He was submissive, and in the midst of a very unjust situation, he was respectful. You know, I think about, also maybe you've done all the right things in your life, in your workplace, and you've gotten passed over for the promotion. Or maybe worse, you've even been demoted. I think about the story of Joseph from the Old Testament. You think about the story of Joseph. He just told his brothers a dream that he had had. And his brothers were like, "Well, we got to get rid of him. We're going to sell him into slavery." And he gets thrown into slavery, but God still continues to use him. In Genesis chapter 39, verse 2, it says the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. Joseph is doing all of the right things. The Lord is with him. He's getting put as an overseer. Things are going really right to him in the midst of a difficult situation. But what do we know about Joseph's story? Unfortunately, that's not the end of his story. Because just a few verses later, he comes in a situation where his master's wife comes to him and tries to seduce him. And he wants to be a man of integrity and a man of purity. Instead, because he rejects her, she accuses him of abusing her. And so just a few verses down from when he was put as an overseer, he continued to do the right thing in his life. Verse 19 says, as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison. So watch this. Watch this. Joseph did not rebel against the orders that he was given to be in prison. He submitted. He was respectful. And obviously, God honored him later on in his life. But listen, if we were just to take a snapshot of his life and a snapshot maybe of your life today, you realize, hey, I've been lied to, or I've done all the right things and I've gotten passed over. Somebody else got the promotion. I was doing way better. My numbers were way better. I wasn't changing them to make them fit my own mold or my own desire to climb this ladder of success. I've been trying to do the right thing, Josh. I've been trying to be pure in my life. I've been trying to be a person of integrity in my life. But I've been passed over. I have been demoted. Josh, what do I do here? The text says it clearly. We submit even when the job is imperfect. Why do we do that? Why? Why would we ever do that? The text says twice something very specific. It says this is a gracious thing. Did you notice that? This is a gracious thing to do this. In other words, a way to extend grace in your workplace is to bring submission into the workplace when someone doesn't deserve it. That's what grace is. Getting something that you do not deserve. And let me make it very spiritual for us all here. Every single one of us that has a relationship with Jesus has been a recipient of the grace of Almighty God. And can I just say this to us all? We never deserved it. We never deserved it. We never deserved the grace of God. We never deserved the forgiveness of God. We never deserved the love of God. We never deserved the mercy from God. We didn't deserve any of that. In fact, we deserved the exact opposite. And yet, Jesus, in his love for us, extended it to us freely. And so, who are we as recipients of grace to say we're going to receive grace, but we're not going to dispense it to anybody else because they don't deserve it? Oh, listen to me. Listen to me. Maybe if you have trouble giving grace, it's likely that you have forgotten that you have received grace. If you have trouble giving grace, it's likely that you've forgotten, oh man, I've received grace. I've gotten it from Jesus. I have received so much in my life, and I am to dispense this in the life of other people. You see, what happens is, he says, hey, servants, be subject to your masters, even if they are unjust, even if they are crooked. But then Peter comes right back around on the backside of that command, and he says something significant. I want you to see the second thing. We are to follow the example of Jesus, who is perfect. We're to follow his example. He has given us grace. Let's learn from him. Verse 21, for to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. How many people today have heard parts of that text before? How many people have heard parts of the text that I just read? We hear it a lot, right? We hear it a lot in church, but we don't hear it in the context in which it was written. Because it's written right after Peter says, you need to submit to your master even if he's unjust. And the reason that you need to do this, because of the example that you have in Jesus. And then he says this amazing passage that you have probably quoted in your life. You've certainly read it over and over and over again. But now maybe you see it in a different light. Because here's what it means that Jesus is our example. A couple of years ago, my kids were learning how to write letters, like the letters of the alphabet. They were learning to write the letters of the alphabet. And so on long car trips, what we would do was we would bring with us a little book that had different letters that they could trace. And the more that they traced the letters, the more comfortable they would be with writing the different letters of the alphabet and then creating words and sentences and paragraphs and essays, etc., right? It all starts with that simple example. Because if you don't get your letters right, you're not writing any essays in college. You're not writing any type of job application. You're not going to be able to do any of that. And so it had those little dotted lines. Y'all remember this? And so we would bring along dry erase markers with us on these long trips. And we would say, Jake, James, you got to do a few minutes in your workbook. And so they would trace the letters. They would go through that, trace the letters. And then we would wipe it clean and say, do it again, right? Do it again. And the trace marks were there to show them how to write the letters. Jesus has set up the trace marks in our life to show us how we are to give grace in the workplace. And I believe there's 4 different examples that he gives in the text. So, just like we just talked about, I've got a special traceable workbook with us this morning, okay? So the first thing that the text says is that Jesus was sinless. Sinless, right? That's the first thing that this text says, that Jesus was our example because he had no sin in his life. And so for us, we're looking at that and we're saying, okay, Jesus, thank you for the example of being sinless. And so you begin to write this, and you begin to trace his steps, and you begin to study his word and say, I want to be like Jesus. He is my example. And so I want to be sinless. And so we begin to follow his example. We're like, yes, I want to live as people, as a person who is sinless, but we come in the midst of a bad situation in our life. We got bad circumstances that surround us. We fall into temptation. And so then we begin to say, Jesus, I know what you have set as an example for me, but I'm going to go my own path, and I'm going to live a sinful life instead of a sinless life. And the problem is this: when we're in our workplace and we begin to think, hey, my boss is so terrible, my professor is so awful, I can't believe they're making us do this, and then we're also the problem, we begin to pick up on some of those negative traits in our own life, we get to be the exact same way that they are. And we're not following the example of Jesus. What about the next thing that it says in the text? Did you see it? It says, there was no deceit found in his mouth. That Jesus was honest, always honest. He was honest when it didn't help him to be honest, right? He always spoke the truth. He spoke the truth when he knew that nobody else was going to like the truth. And so we're looking at this and we're saying, yeah, we see that it's great to be honest in our life, but instead we're just going to go our own path, and we're going to be people that are deceitful in our life instead of following the example of Christ. Because, Josh, it would look better if I changed my numbers just a little bit. Maybe I can just round them up to make them look like I'm doing a better job than I actually am. Maybe I did not fulfill one of my responsibilities. And so instead of taking the blame on myself, instead of taking the responsibility for myself, I'm going to blame somebody else. Well, it was because they did something. They're the problem. They're not doing their job, so I can't possibly do mine. You know, I didn't really understand when you really did understand. But we just say, hey, God, I got my own ideas. I got my own design that I want to follow. The text also says, and this is really interesting, it says that when he was reviled, verse 23, look at this. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. I just picture Jesus with that crossbeam across his back that he was taking to go to die for me and you. And I just imagine the people that were like beating him and making fun of him along the way. And what if Jesus decided, yeah, I've got this weapon on my back. These people are saying all these things. I'm just going to hit them. I'm just going to hit them in return for what they're saying. Jesus didn't do that even when the temperature was the hottest. Even when it was the worst situation for him. He willingly suffered, and listen, he showed us what it means to be poised. To be poised. In the midst of difficulty, in the midst of people making fun of you, in the midst of people saying all kinds of negative things about you, in the midst of physical suffering, he said, I am not going to diverge from the mission that my Father has called me to. I'm going to be a person that is poised. If somebody says something to you that's negative, that you don't like, maybe somebody has given you some correction, and maybe you're like, oh, they should look in the mirror. They need correction. They need to change their life. The opposite of being poised, and listen, I've done it so much, is to respond in some type of emotional way. And so instead of being poised, We're going to say, hey, Jesus, yeah, I know your example is good, but did you really go through this? He's like, yeah. Did you really go through that? Do you really understand what it feels like to be lied to? Did you really understand what it feels like to be gossiped about? Yeah. Do you understand what it's like to have physical suffering beyond our wildest imaginations? Yes. And we want to respond in emotion, but Jesus says, I've set the example to be poised, that when I am reviled, I'm not going to revile in return. Last thing we see in the text, example of Jesus is this. It says that he did not threaten, watch this, end of verse 23, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Jesus gave us an example of what it means to be trusting, truly trusting. Trusting the plan of the Lord. You probably remember when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane and he was on his way to the cross. And what happened? Jesus began to pray, and this is what he prayed. He prayed, Father, if there is any other way, let this cup pass from me. But then he said something very significant. He said, but not my will, but yours be done. Not my will, but yours be done. And in that way, he showed us the incredible trust in one of the most difficult of times that he had for his Father. Can I just ask you this today? Do you truly trust God? It's easy to trust God when everything is going right, when everything is easy in your life, when everything is simple and carefree and you don't have any trouble and you don't have any ailments and you don't have any reason to worry. But what about when times get hard? What about when people come into your life and they're deceptive to you? They act one way around you and they're completely different aside from you. What about the people who come into your life and you think they're going to be your best friends and they end up betraying you in the end? What about the boss that treats you unfairly and unjustly every single day? What about the professor that knows that you're a believer and he wants to specifically prod you just to simply see how you will respond as a Christian? He wants to say things that get on your nerves. He wants to say things that he knows you'll disagree with. He just wants to see how you're going to respond. What about then? Are we going to be people that trust the Lord? Listen, watch this. Or are we going to be people that are overwhelmed with worry in our life and fear? There are so many people, in a group of this size, there are so many people in the room today that I believe are overwhelmed with worry in your life. You're overwhelmed with worry in your life. And because we've got such a wide span of ages, they're about different things. They're about different things. But it doesn't mean that somebody's worry because it's about something different than mine is less than me. And what we all need is to follow the example of Jesus, that when his life was the toughest, he was the exact same. He trusted his Father, even when it didn't make sense. He trusted his Father even when it was difficult. He trusted his Father even when it physically hurt him to do so. He didn't get overwhelmed with worry or fear in his life. He said, I want to do exactly what God the Father put me on this planet to do. Worry is a huge distraction in your life. Fear is a huge distraction in your life because it takes our focus off of doing what God has set us on this planet to do. And so the question today is very simple as our band comes back up. The question is this: are we going to follow the example of Jesus or not? Are we going to follow his example or not? Are we going to be people that say, I want to trace your letters in your way? I want to submit even when my boss or my professor or my leader or my parent or whoever is not the greatest. Even when they're the worst, I want to show respect. And the reason I want to show respect is because I have been a recipient of the grace of God, and so I want to, as a believer in Jesus, I don't want to be like the other workers in my workplace. I don't want to be like the other people on my team. I don't want to be like the other students in my class. I want to be different. I have Jesus inside of me. And so I want to give grace because I've been given it over and over and over again.